They rode into legend not because they were noble, but because they were feared. The Old West was not the endless shootouts and glory-filled adventures that Hollywood likes to paint, but it was a land where survival often belonged to the ruthless, and in the pages of history, a handful of names rose above the rest. Men who lived outside the law, men whose reputations spread faster than the telegraph could carry the news, men who made their mark in blood and smoke. These were the outlaws, the dark shadows of the frontier, and their stories remind us that the Wild West was not only about cowboys and cattle drives, but also about men who thrived on fear and chaos. Tonight, we'll dive into the lives of 10 of the most ruthless outlaws who ever set foot across the frontier. But be warned, and the truth is darker, more violent, and far more tragic than the myths you've been told. Let's begin with Jesse James. To many, he was a folk hero, a rebel who fought the system, a man who struck back against banks and railroads. But the truth beneath the legend is far less noble. Jesse James began as a Confederate guerrilla during the Civil War, riding with Quantrill's Raiders and Bloody Bill Anderson, men infamous for their brutal raids, ambushes, and massacres. When the war ended, Jesse did not put down his guns. Instead, he turned to robbery. With his brother Frank, Jesse formed the James Younger Gang, robbing banks, stagecoaches, and trains. Newspapers painted him as a Robin Hood, but there's no record that Jesse ever gave to the poor. He kept the money for himself, and those who stood in his way often died for it. In 1876, the gang attempted to rob the First National Bank in Northfield, Minnesota, but the townspeople fought back. Bullets flew, gang members fell, and Jesse barely escaped with his life. That day marked the beginning of the end for his legend. But still he persisted until his own gang turned on him. In 1882, Robert Ford shot Jesse in the back of the head while he adjusted a picture on the wall, a coward's death for a man who had lived by violence. Jesse James became a legend, yes, but a legend built on blood, not benevolence. Then there was Billy the Kid. His real name was Henry McCarty, though he also went by William Bonney. He was young, reckless, and deadly. The myth says he killed 21 men, one for every year of his life, but the truth is closer to 8. Still, even 8 is a heavy number for a boy barely out of his teens. Billy grew up poor, drifting from job to job, always on the edge of trouble. In New Mexico, he became embroiled in the Lincoln County War, a violent conflict between rival factions fighting for control of trade and cattle. Billy aligned himself with the regulators, and soon his name was whispered across the territory. He was quick with a gun, yes, but more importantly, he was unpredictable. He escaped from jail multiple times, once killing 2 deputies in the process. Newspapers called him the Kid, and his boyish face made the contrast with his deadly reputation all the more striking. He laughed at danger, charmed those around him, and seemed to dance with death. But his luck couldn't last forever. Sheriff Pat Garrett tracked him down in 1881 and shot him dead in a darkened room. Billy was only 21, but his myth had already taken root. Hollywood would later turn him into a tragic anti-hero, but the truth is simpler. He was a dangerous young outlaw who lived fast and died young, leaving behind a legacy of fear and fascination. Another figure looms large in the outlaw pantheon, Butch Cassidy whenever possible. But don't let that fool you. He was still ruthless in his own way. Born Robert Leroy Parker, he took his nickname from a Wyoming outlaw named Mike Cassidy. Butch was charming, intelligent, and unlike Jesse James or Billy the Kid, he preferred to avoid killing with his partner. The Sundance Kid, Butch led the Wild Bunch, a gang that pulled off some of the most daring robberies of the West. Banks, trains, and payroll shipments all fell prey to his carefully planned heists. Unlike the chaotic violence of other gangs, Butch's operations were organized, efficient, and devastating. The Wild Bunch became famous for their string of robberies in the 1890s, and for their ability to evade capture. Pinkerton detectives pursued them relentlessly, but Butch and Sundance always seemed one step ahead. Their story supposedly ended in Bolivia, where after one final robbery they were cornered by soldiers and killed in a hail of bullets. Some say they survived, slipping away to live quietly under new names. But whether dead in Bolivia or alive in hiding, their legend became immortal. Butch Cassidy was no Robin Hood, but he was a mastermind of crime, a man who built a reputation not on brutality alone but on cleverness and daring. If Butch Cassidy was a calculating thief, John Wesley Hardin was a whirlwind of violence. He claimed to have killed more than 40 men, though historians put the number closer to 27. Still, that's enough to earn him a place among the most ruthless. Hardin was born in Texas in 1853, and from an early age he seemed drawn to violence. At 15, he killed a freedman in a dispute, setting him on a bloody path that would last for decades. Hardin shot men over card games, arguments, even snoring. He once killed a man just for snoring too loudly in the next room. His life was a trail of corpses, and though he was arrested multiple times, he often escaped or talked his way out. Eventually, he was captured and sentenced to 25 years in prison. While behind bars, he studied law, and upon his release, he even tried to practice it. But old habits die hard. Hardin returned to the outlaw life, and in 1895, he was gunned down in El Paso by Constable John Selman. Hardin's death was as violent as his life, and his reputation as one of the bloodiest gunfighters of the West remained secure. Cole Younger, a member of the infamous James Younger gang, deserves mention as well. Alongside Jesse James, he participated in robberies that shook the frontier. But the Northfield raid in Minnesota sealed his fate. Cole was shot multiple times during the botched robbery, captured and sentenced to life in prison. He spent more than 2 decades behind bars before being paroled. Unlike Jesse, Cole lived to old age, dying quietly in Missouri. But the scars of his violent life, both physical and emotional, never left him. Cole was ruthless in his prime, but his long years in prison stripped away the glamour, leaving only a man broken by his own choices. By now, you can see a pattern forming. These men, remembered as larger-than-life figures, were in truth often desperate, reckless, and brutal. Their legends grew because newspapers needed stories, because people craved excitement, because Hollywood needed heroes and villains. But behind the myths, the reality was harsher. These were not noble rebels, but criminals, men who chose a life of violence and often paid the ultimate price. And as we continue, we'll meet more of them, each with his own dark story, each carving his name into the history of the frontier with bullets and blood. After the James brothers and their partners had etched their bloody saga into frontier history, another figure began casting a long, dangerous shadow over the plains. His name was Sam Bass, and though his career as an outlaw was brief, it was marked by audacity and arrogance that made him infamous. Born in Indiana, Bass drifted westward, eventually finding his way to Texas. There he dabbled in horse racing and petty theft, before moving on to far bigger targets. In 1877, Bass and his gang pulled off one of the largest train robberies in American history. They looted a Union Pacific train near Big Springs, Nebraska, and made off with over $60,000 in newly minted gold coins, an astronomical sum at the time. That single robbery cemented his reputation, but it also painted a target on his back. Lawmen pursued him relentlessly, and though Bass enjoyed a short period of freedom, the chase finally caught up with him in Round Rock, Texas. In July 1878, during a shootout with Texas Rangers, Bass was fatally wounded. He lingered for 2 days before dying on his 27th birthday. His career was short, his crimes bold, and his downfall inevitable. Sam Bass became another symbol of the outlaw life, dazzling in its defiance, but fleeting in its end. Not all outlaws were born into obscurity, however. Take William Clark Quantrill, whose name alone struck terror into the hearts of frontier communities. Quantrill wasn't merely an outlaw. He was a guerrilla leader whose violence blurred the line between warfare and murder. During the Civil War, Quantrill formed a band of raiders who operated in Missouri and Kansas, carrying out brutal attacks on Union forces and civilians alike. His most infamous act came in 1863, with the Lawrence Massacre, when his men rode into Lawrence, Kansas, and slaughtered over 150 men and boys, burning much of the town to the ground. The brutality shocked the nation, and though Quantrill framed it as retaliation for Union actions, many saw it as a crime beyond redemption. After the war, Quantrill tried to continue his bloody ways, but the Confederacy's defeat left him a fugitive. In 1865, Union troops ambushed his band in Kentucky, and Quantrill was mortally wounded. He was just 27 years old, but his reputation as one of the most ruthless killers of the frontier was already secured. He wasn't a romantic outlaw or a misunderstood hero. He was a man who embraced violence as his creed and left behind a trail of ashes and corpses. Another figure, Less notorious than Jesse James but no less feared in his day, was Bill Doolin. He started out riding with the Dalton gang, a group of brothers who attempted one of the most daring bank robberies in Western history. In 1892, the Daltons tried to rob 2 banks at once in Coffeyville, Kansas, but the townspeople fought back fiercely. 4 of the 5 gang members were killed on the spot, leaving only Emmett Dalton alive. Bill Doolin had skipped the raid, and that decision may have saved his life. Afterward, he formed his own crew, known as the Wild Bunch, not to be confused with Butch Cassidy and DS gang of the same nickname. Doolin's Wild Bunch terrorized Oklahoma territory throughout the 1890s, robbing trains, stagecoaches, and banks. Unlike Butch Cassidy, Doolin's gang was known for its violence, often killing lawmen and bystanders during their raids. The government responded by creating a special force of deputy marshals known as the Three Guardsmen to hunt them down. One by one, the gang was killed or captured. Doolin himself was gunned down by U.S. Marshals in 1896. His body was riddled with bullets, his reign of terror cut short. Bill Doolin is remembered not for cleverness or charm, but for the sheer bloodshed his gang unleashed on the frontier. As we move deeper into the world of these ruthless men, one outlaw's name stands out for the sheer brutality of his methods: Cherokee Bill. Born Crawford Goldsby in 1876, he was of mixed African American, Native American, and white ancestry. By the age of 18, he had already earned a reputation as a cold-blooded killer. His criminal career began with robbery, but it quickly escalated to murder. When asked why he killed so many, Cherokee Bill allegedly said, "I never killed a man who didn't need killing." It was the kind of chilling line that newspapers loved to print, further cementing his image as a merciless outlaw. In just 2 short years, he was accused of killing at least 13 men, often during robberies or disputes. Lawmen finally captured him in 1895, and despite multiple escape attempts, he was hanged the following year at the age of 20. His final words were flippant, dismissive of his fate. Cherokee Bill embodied the ruthless streak of the outlaw world, a young man consumed by violence with no thought for the lives he shattered along the way. Then there was Belle Starr, the so-called bandit queen. While most outlaw stories focus on men, Belle carved her own bloody reputation. Born Myra Maybelle Shirley in Missouri, she lived through the chaos of the Civil War, her family aligned with Confederate sympathizers. After marrying outlaw Jim Reed, she became deeply entangled in the world of crime. When Reed was killed, Belle remarried into the Starr family, a notorious clan of horse thieves and criminals operating in Indian Territory. She was often accused of masterminding robberies, harboring fugitives, and profiting from stolen goods. Whether she was as active in the crimes as legend suggests or merely surrounded by outlaws, her name became synonymous with danger. Belle carried herself with an air of defiance, riding side saddle with pistols strapped to her waist, earning her a place in dime novels and lurid headlines. In 1889, her life ended as violently as it was lived. She was ambushed and shot in the back near her home in Oklahoma. Her murder was never solved, but her legend only grew. The Bandit Queen had become as notorious as any male outlaw, a symbol of how ruthlessness knew no gender on the frontier. What connects all these stories is not glory, but violence. These outlaws lived hard and died harder, often hunted down by determined lawmen or betrayed by their own comrades. Their legends were shaped by newspapers hungry for sensation, and later by Hollywood's craving for drama. But beneath the myth lies the truth. They were ruthless because they had to be. The frontier was not kind to those who hesitated, and these men and women embraced brutality as their path to survival, wealth, or power. Yet in doing so, they sowed the seeds of their own destruction. Lawmen grew stronger, communities grew bolder, and the days of the outlaw were numbered. Still, their stories endure. We remember Jesse James not as a murderer but as a rebel. We picture Billy the Kid grinning at the camera, forever young. We imagine Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid going out in a blaze of glory. But the reality is far more complicated and far darker. These outlaws weren't legends when they lived. They were threats, feared, and hunted. Only later, after the dust settled, did the myths take shape, sanding off the rough edges, turning criminals into icons. And as we move forward into the final chapters of this tale, we'll see how some of the most feared names of the West ended their days, not with glory but with bullets, betrayal, and the relentless march of time. As the frontier drew closer to the 20th century, the outlaw was no longer just a figure in dusty towns or remote gulches. He had become a symbol, feared in some places, admired in others, and relentlessly pursued by lawmen who were getting more organized, more connected, and far better armed than the days when Jesse James first drew his Colt. Yet despite the tightening noose, a few ruthless figures managed to carve their names into history during those waning years of the Wild West, their stories filled with betrayal, brutality, and bloody ends. One of the last great outlaw names to shake the frontier was the Dalton gang. The Daltons were brothers, former lawmen who turned their backs on the badge and embraced crime. Bob Gratt and Emmett Dalton led the group, and though they lacked the cunning of Butch Cassidy or the sheer ferocity of John Wesley Hardin, their ambition was unmatched. In October of 1892, they attempted something no gang had ever dared, robbing two banks simultaneously in broad daylight. Their target was Coffeyville, Kansas, a bustling town filled with armed citizens who weren't about to hand over their savings. The Daltons rode in with guns drawn, but the townsfolk responded with rifles and shotguns. What followed was a bloody shootout in the streets. When the smoke cleared, 4 of the gang lay dead, including Bob and Gratt. Emmett survived, but was riddled with bullets and captured. He served 14 years in prison before eventually being pardoned, living to tell the tale of that fateful day. The Dalton gang's audacity had been their undoing, and their name became synonymous with reckless violence and ultimate failure. Not every outlaw commanded a gang, though. Some, like Jim Miller, also known as Killer Miller, operated as lone wolves or hired guns. Miller cultivated an image of respectability, dressing well, attending church, and speaking softly. But beneath that facade lay one of the coldest killers in Western history. He was accused of murdering his grandparents as a teenager, though he was never convicted. As he grew older, Miller developed a reputation as a hired assassin, allegedly killing over a dozen men for pay. He was meticulous, often ambushing his targets with a shotgun, earning himself a reputation as someone who always struck from the shadows. Despite his brutality, he managed to avoid conviction time and again, thanks to legal technicalities and powerful allies. But in 1909, his luck ran out. Arrested for a high-profile assassination in Oklahoma, Miller found himself locked in a jail where local citizens had no intention of waiting for a trial. A lynch mob dragged him out and hanged him alongside 3 other men. True to his reputation for cold defiance, Miller's last words were, "Let her rip." His execution ended the career of one of the West's most calculating killers, a man who proved that ruthlessness wasn't always loud or flashy. Sometimes it was quiet, patient, and deadly. Another outlaw whose story reflects both the desperation and violence of the time was Tom Horn. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Horn had been a lawman and a scout before turning to darker work. Born in Missouri, Horn served as a scout for the U.S. Army during campaigns against Native American tribes and later worked as a Pinkerton detective. But he eventually turned to freelance work as a hired gun, taking contracts from powerful cattle barons to deal with rustlers and troublemakers. Horn's methods were simple and ruthless. He ambushed his targets and shot them down without warning. Some claimed he killed at least 17 men this way. His reputation for efficiency made him both feared and despised. In 1901, Horn was accused of murdering a 14-year-old boy named Willie Nickel, allegedly because the boy's family had been feuding with a rancher who may have hired Horn. The evidence against him was circumstantial, but Horn's own drunken boast, claiming responsibility for the killing, sealed his fate. He was tried, convicted, and hanged in 1903. To some, he was a scapegoat, punished for a crime he didn't commit. To others, he was finally paying for years of bloodshed carried out in the shadows. Either way, Tom Horn's story highlights the fine line between lawman and outlaw, and how easily a man could cross it in the ruthless world of the frontier. Then there was Sam Starr, husband of Belle Starr, whose name carried its own weight of infamy. Sam and Belle operated deep within Indian territory, running with thieves, outlaws, and fugitives. Together, they built a reputation as masterminds of crime, and their home became a safe haven for criminals on the run. Sam was known for his violent temper and involvement in horse theft and robbery, and his partnership with Belle made them one of the most infamous couples of the frontier. But like so many others, Sam's career was cut short by violence. In 1886, he was shot and killed in a gunfight with another outlaw. His death, combined with Bell's assassination just 3 years later, ended the Star reign of terror. Their story reminds us that the outlaw life was often short, brutal, and destined to collapse under the weight of its own violence. Another notorious figure of the West was Clay Allison, a man both celebrated and feared for his violent temper and unpredictable nature. Born in Tennessee, Allison fought in the Civil War before drifting westward, where he quickly gained a reputation as a gunfighter. Stories about him vary wildly, with some claiming he killed over a dozen men, while others suggest many of his supposed shootouts were exaggerated. What is clear is that Allison had a hair-trigger temper. He was known to fly into violent rages, often fueled by alcohol. One story claims he decapitated a man and paraded the head through town as a warning. Whether true or exaggerated, the tale cemented his image as a ruthless and terrifying figure. Unlike many outlaws, Allison did not die in a blaze of gunfire. In 1887, he was thrown from a wagon and killed when a wheel rolled over his neck. It was an oddly mundane death for a man whose life had been anything but ordinary. Still, his name lingered in frontier lore as one of the West's most dangerous personalities. All these men, and women like Belle Starr, remind us that ruthlessness was not always about scale. Some commanded gangs, pulling off daring robberies that shook entire territories. Others worked in the shadows, killing quietly for money or personal grudges, and some simply lived lives of reckless violence, their reputations built as much on fear and rumor as on documented fact. But whether they were folk heroes, cold-blooded killers, or something in between, they all became part of the tapestry of the West. By the late 1800s, the outlaw era was waning. Railroads connected towns, telegraphs sped up communication, and professional law enforcement grew more effective. No longer could a gang disappear into the wilderness for months, living off stolen money. The frontier was shrinking, civilization was advancing, and the ruthless outlaws who had once thrived were being hunted down one by one. Yet even as their days came to an end, their stories were just beginning. Dime novels, newspapers, and eventually Hollywood would turn them into legends, exaggerating their deeds, painting them as rebels or anti-heroes, and ensuring their names would outlive their bloody careers. The reality, however, is less glamorous. They were men and women who killed, robbed, and terrorized to survive or to get rich. Their ruthlessness was not the mark of nobility, but of desperation, greed, or cruelty. And yet, perhaps it is precisely because of that darkness that we remain fascinated by them. For in the story of the ruthless outlaw, we see both the brutality of the frontier and the enduring human hunger for legends. The few men awake at that hour, gamblers clutching cards, drunks stumbling from saloons, stepped cautiously into the empty street, squinting into the darkness. Wide shots show their silhouettes framed by flickering lanterns and moonlight. The town eerily silent except for the distant thunder of hooves. Medium shots capture tense postures, hands hovering near belts or railings, eyes scanning shadows for movement. Close-ups reveal faces lined with suspicion and fear, pupils dilated, breaths visible in the cold night air. All senses strained as the approaching riders cast long, ominous silhouettes across the prairie. But whatever they were, they rode straight to the fresh grave. Wide shots reveal the black silhouettes of riders converging on the shallow mound, moonlight glinting off worn saddles and gloved hands. Medium shots show townsfolk frozen on porches and streets, breaths caught in the cold night air, eyes following every deliberate movement. Close-ups focus on the riders' faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, shadows swallowing any hint of humanity. The horses' hooves disturb neither dust nor soil, and the silence around them amplifies the weight of their purpose. The scene is tense, haunting, and charged with the uncanny, as if the land itself bends to witness this ritual of the forgotten dead.